it is sadly true that the most interesting thing Ben could find to say about me is that I collect fountain pens. But if you're interested, I can thoroughly recommend the vintage pen section of andyspens.co.uk. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the impact that the spending cuts are likely to have on public sector organisations, but also on companies that supply services to the government and to the wider public sector. When the Chancellor gave his emergency budget in June, he did two things that were denounced as reckless and as gambles by the opposition. The risk was that they would put the recovery in danger and possibly tip us into a double-dip recession. The first was that he said he was going to start cutting public expenditure in 2010, rather than waiting to 2011 as the previous government had intended. And then secondly, he announced that the government would aim to eliminate the structural deficit over the lifetime of a parliament, rather than simply aiming to halve it over that period. Now, the first of those things was, in my opinion, never a gamble at all, because 6 billion, which is the sum that was targeted in the current financial year, may sound like a lot of money on a personal level, but whether the economy recovered strongly or stalled in 2010 was never going to depend on an additional £6 billion worth of public spending cuts. It was much more a statement of intent about an incoming government, by an incoming government, about it being determined to start early and really to demonstrate to the markets and to the analysts and so on that it was serious. But what is clear is that 6 billion will be delivered in cuts in the current financial year, and what's more, we have just had 2 quarters of surprisingly strong economic growth. And I didn't say, Ben, that we've never had a recession. I merely said we're not in one right at this moment. I think it's important that we shouldn't talk ourselves into an even greater sense of depression than we might be in already. So from the Chancellor's point of view, I think so far so good. But actually, that initial round of cuts was only the start. But interestingly as well, the pinch from that 6 billion hasn't really been felt in the public sector at all. It hasn't been felt much, I think, by government departments, by NHS trusts, by local authorities and so on. Where the cuts have started to bite already is in parts of the private sector, because the government has more or less stopped buying external advice, it's more or less stopped letting big IT contracts, and it's put pressure on its suppliers with long-term contracts to cut their margins. And we hosted a dinner yesterday evening of the Business Services Association, and our guest was Francis Maud, who is the Cabinet Office Minister. And it was actually a pretty amicable discussion, because actually if a customer decides that they don't want to buy your services any longer, there's really no point in having a go at them. It's their right to do so. But it was clear that the firms represented around the table were having quite a tough time, and in some cases they're hurting quite badly. And that pain will, I think, continue for some time. Those firms which have longer-term contracts will start to experience the pain somewhat later. And the firms with short-term contracts, which have to be renewed at short intervals, are starting to feel the pain already. And there are some companies which are already experiencing a decline of 50, 80, even 100% or close to 100% in their revenues because of their dependency on public sector contracts. And it's those suppliers who are heavily exposed to the public sector who are obviously at greatest risk. And some of them will go under, there is no doubt about that. And you can start to see in the share price of 1 or 2 companies which are heavily exposed to the public sector that is beginning to happen. Of course, the majority of companies, the majority of businesses, don't have that level of exposure to public sector contracts. For what it's worth, KPMG last year had about 12% of our fee income in the UK from the public sector. About half of that was from the government and the other half from the devolved public sector. So what we will do, and what similar firms will undoubtedly do if they're facing pressure in their public sector business, is that we will, as far as possible, redeploy people to work on our private sector clients. And the financial sector is booming from our point of view at the moment. But there is a risk for the government that some of those firms will probably exit the market altogether in the medium term, and it may then create a problem for the government if it decides it does actually need the support that it was getting in due course. But so far, as I said, I think there's been relatively little impact in the public sector, which in a way is surprising, because if there are big cuts coming, wouldn't you expect well-run organisations to be starting to take action right now? And certainly some of them have. But I think it's probably true to say, certainly it's my experience, that the majority have not. And I think that's the case because for more than a decade, that strategy has worked. When there are predictions of doom and gloom, what you do in the public sector is you wait and see, you hope it will go away, you wish it would never happen, and actually that has been a perfectly rational strategy, because up to now it has never happened. But it is going to be different over the next 4 or 5 years, because the cuts that the government is planning over that period are genuinely unprecedented. £6 billion in year was manageable, but no government in living memory has managed to restrain public expenditure in the way that this government is planning to do over a 4 or 5 year period. And there are still some commentators who say, well, it's not really a big deal, because all they're going to do is by 2014-15 they will have wound public expenditure back to the level that it was at in 2008 or 2009. And it's an interesting fact that as Chancellor, George Osborne will spend more in cash terms every year that he's Chancellor than Gordon Brown ever did. But that really is an incorrect way of looking at things. The public sector has got used to substantial year-on-year real terms increases in funding. And it will find it enormously difficult, effectively, to wind the clock back to where it was 6 years previously in real terms. I think that means almost certainly that in the course of the next year, 2 years, 3 years, we will see public sector organisations running out of cash. The public sector equivalent of insolvencies. Now, it's not entirely clear what that means in the public sector. In some cases, it will mean that those organisations get bailed out, because it will be too embarrassing for the government to see them go under. In other cases, we will see public sector organisations taking over other public bodies. We're going to see NHS trusts acquiring other NHS trusts. But there will also be organisations, I think, that simply go out of business altogether. And we're going to see this happening in local authorities, in the NHS, in universities and FE colleges and so on. It's not going to happen on a large scale, but it will happen, and it will cause waves when it does happen. But actually my main concern, as somebody who works with public sector organisations, and I have done for most of my career, is not that we may see some of them go to the wall, because I think that's probably a painful but necessary thing to happen. My actual concern is that the majority of public sector organisations, the ones that survive, will survive by muddling through. They'll cut their costs in an uncoordinated and relatively unplanned way, and they will therefore miss the opportunity that private sector organisations have been taking over a longer period of time to reorganise their businesses, to change their business models, to take advantage of new technology, to find new and better ways of interacting with citizens and customers. And therefore we will miss what is genuinely, I think, a golden opportunity to achieve public sector reform, which we haven't seen and which we desperately need. Thank you.